The moment I finished signing, my attorney leaned across the conference table and said my name in a voice like a man watching someone walk off a cliff. I set down the pen and smiled at him. Vincent's lawyer, a sharp-faced woman named Ms. Caldwell, was making a very careful effort not to look pleased with herself. She wasn't quite succeeding. My attorney, Mr. Fenton, had gone the color of old paper, and I sat there with my hands folded in my lap and thought, not one person in this room knows what I found last night. But I'm getting ahead of myself. 3 months before that morning, I was sitting at the kitchen table of the house I'd lived in for 37 years, holding a receipt I'd found folded inside my husband's coat pocket. And I was not ahead of anything. I was behind everything. My hands wouldn't stop shaking. I had to press them flat against the table to keep from having to look at them. The receipt was from a restaurant in Nashville, dinner for two. The date was a Thursday in April, the same Thursday Vincent had told me he was catching up on surgical notes at the hospital. I don't know how long I sat there. Long enough for the kitchen to go gold and then gray as the afternoon moved past the windows. Long enough to walk back through the previous 8 months in my head. The late evenings that started in February. The new cologne that appeared in March. The way his phone had migrated from the kitchen counter to permanently inside his jacket pocket. The odd, careful politeness that had replaced the easy carelessness of 38 years of marriage. I'm 66 years old. I had been with Vincent since I was 25. I had told myself, more than once in those 8 months, that I was imagining things. That I was the kind of woman who found patterns where there were none, who worried at small things until they grew large. I had talked myself out of knowing what I knew. That evening I stopped doing that. I set the receipt on the dinner table between us. I didn't explain it or build up to it. I just said, "Who were you with?" He looked at it for a long time. Then he said her name, Darcy, a pharmaceutical sales representative who called on his office and told me it had been going on for 2 years. And then he said, "Elsa, I think this marriage is over." 41 years, gone while the pasta water was still warm on the stove. I moved to my sister's house the following week. I thought that was the right thing to do. Give space, let things settle. I would understand much later when an attorney explained it to me in a conference room that voluntarily leaving the marital home had complicated my position in ways I hadn't anticipated. I didn't know that yet. What I knew was that my sister made strong coffee and didn't fill the silence with noise, and those 2 things were all I could ask for at the time. 3 weeks later, I sat across from Mr. Fenton, who had done our wills twice and helped us refinance the house and handled a small property dispute with a neighbor back in 2009. He was a good man. He was not a divorce attorney, and we both knew it, though neither of us said so. He read through Vincent's proposed settlement with increasing discomfort. "Elsa," he said finally, setting the papers down, "he's offering you $80,000 and your vehicle." I know. The house is valued at $640,000, and the practice, he's disclosed the practice value at $1.4 million, which I suspect is conservative. You worked there for 22 years. Kentucky law would give you. What are my realistic chances if we fight it? I said. He took off his glasses. A man taking off his glasses to tell you something honest. Difficult, he admitted. He restructured the practice to a solo professional corporation in 1994. Everything since then is in his name alone. You stopped working there in 2004? That's nearly 2 decades. Establishing your ownership contribution now, without formal employment records, could take years in litigation and cost you substantially in legal fees. You might come out with less than. What if I sign his terms? I said, right now, today. He stared at me. Elsa, no. What if I do? You would be giving up a legitimate claim to potentially millions of dollars. You would have no security. You are 66 years old. Where would you live? How would you? But I had already reached for the pen. Here is what Mr. Fenton didn't know. Here is what no one knew, not even my sister, because I hadn't told a soul yet. The night before, somewhere around 2 in the morning, I had opened a cardboard box. When I'd packed to leave the house, I'd grabbed everything from the back closet of the home office, mostly out of instinct, partly out of spite, if I'm being honest with myself. There was a box back there I'd always meant to go through, dusty, unlabeled, pushed back behind the tax files. Old medical records, I'd assumed, the kind of thing you keep meaning to sort and never do. At 2 in the morning at my sister's kitchen table, with weak tea and the refrigerator humming in sleep, completely out of reach, I finally opened it. The first thing I found was a photograph. Vincent and me, young and a little frightened looking, standing in front of a glass door with hand-lettered text, Lexington Family Orthopedic Associates. Grand opening, March 1986. I was holding a ring of keys. He had his arm around my shoulders. We were both grinning like we couldn't quite believe what we'd done. Then I found the articles of incorporation. Lexington Family Orthopedic Associates, co-founded and jointly owned by Dr. Vincent Hargrove and Elsa Hargrove, equal partners. March 3, 1986. My hands went very still. I spent the next 3 hours going through that box with the careful attention of a woman who had spent 22 years doing medical billing and never threw away a piece of paper if it might someday matter. Which was exactly what I had been. Vincent used to tease me about it at parties. Elsa's filing system, he'd say, shaking his head fondly. That woman still has the receipt from when we bought our first examining table. I still had it. I also had, in that cardboard box, 8 years of Medicare credentialing applications listing me as administrator and co-owner, insurance enrollment documents from 3 separate carriers, all signed by both of us. Letters Vincent had written to hospital committees in the late 80s and early 90s referring to me as his wife and business partner. An SBA loan application from 1989 listing us as joint applicants and co-owners. And then I found the piece of paper I hadn't remembered existed until I was holding it. A letter Vincent had sent to the Hospital Privileges Committee in 1991, typed on practice letterhead and signed in his handwriting, which read in part, "All administrative correspondence should be directed to my wife and co-owner, Elsa, who manages the operational side of our joint practice." He had restructured the practice to a solo professional corporation in 1994. I remembered signing something that year. A thick stack of documents, he said, were tax restructuring, which I had signed without reading carefully because I trusted him. That was the last time my name appeared on anything connected to the practice. But for 8 years before that, from 1986 to 1994, I had been a co-founder and equal partner of a medical practice now worth, according to Vincent's own deliberately low estimate, $1.4 million. The sun was coming up when I finished going through the box. I went to the signing. I signed everything. I smiled. And then I drove to my sister's house, sat in her driveway for 15 minutes without being able to move, and finally went inside to make a phone call I'd already decided on at 3 in the morning. Vance Holloway had a reputation in Lexington. Aggressive, expensive, known for taking cases others had written off. My daughter had mentioned him once in connection with a friend's legal matter. I had filed the name away without consciously knowing why, the way you do with things that might matter someday. His assistant told me his calendar was full through the end of the month. I said, "I have the original articles of incorporation proving joint co-ownership of a medical practice my husband is claiming is solely his. I signed away my rights yesterday morning. The documents haven't been filed yet." She said, "Can you be here at 3:30? Vance Holloway was in his late 50s, silver-haired, unhurried, with the quality of stillness that means someone is always listening more carefully than they appear to be. He went through my box of documents for 45 minutes without speaking. I sat across the desk from him and drank the water his assistant had brought me and tried not to read his face. When he finally looked up, he said, "Mrs. Hargrove, do you know what you've done?" My heart seized. Made a catastrophic mistake? No. He leaned back. You signed under duress with inadequate legal representation, without full and accurate disclosure of marital assets, and you signed yesterday. The papers haven't been filed with the court, which means they are legally challengeable. He tapped the Articles of Incorporation with one finger. This document establishes that you were an equal co-founder of this practice at its inception. Combined with the supporting documentation you've brought me, the credentialing applications, the hospital letters, the loan paperwork, you have a strong and well-documented claim to co-ownership for the founding period. Your husband chose not to disclose this history in his financial filings. He folded his hands on the desk and looked at me with the directness of a man who deals in hard facts for a living. That's called fraudulent concealment of marital assets. And the statement his attorney made, that you had no legal claim to the practice because you hadn't worked there for 19 years, was made with full knowledge that these documents existed, which makes it worse, not better, for their side. I felt something shift in my chest, something I hadn't felt in weeks. Here's what we're going to do, he said. We file a motion to set aside the settlement. Duress, inadequate representation, material non-disclosure. Simultaneously, we request a forensic accounting of the practice going back 10 years. If Dr. Hargrove has been using practice funds for personal expenses related to his relationship with, he glanced at his notes. Miss Darcy Ferris? Yes. Then we will find it. These things are never as hidden as people believe. He looked at me steadily. Mrs. Hargrove, you haven't lost this case. You've actually put yourself in a considerably stronger position than if you'd gone to court 2 days ago. It was the first full breath I'd taken in a month. The motion was filed the next morning. By noon, Vance called to tell me that Ms. Caldwell had already been on the phone and that she was, in his characterization, quite unhappy. What did you say to her? I asked. That my client has reconsidered the settlement upon reviewing evidence of undisclosed marital assets and material misrepresentation. I also informed her that we'd be deposing Dr. Hargrove regarding practice finances and his personal relationship with Miss Ferris. How much do you know about her? Enough. 2 years, as you said, pharmaceutical sales. He's been paying for dinners, hotel stays, and gifts. We'll know more after the forensic accountant finishes. 2 years. I had spent those same 2 years clipping articles about retirement destinations and researching what it would cost to convert the garage into a proper art studio. I had been planning a future with a man who had already checked out of it. The grief hit me then, unexpected and sharp. It passed in a few minutes, the way hard rain does, and then I was back on solid ground, clearer than before. Vincent called me at 7 the next morning. We hadn't spoken since the night he told me her name. You hired Vance Holloway. His voice was tight. Elsa, what exactly are you trying to do? I'm trying to ensure that 41 years of marriage and 22 years of building a medical practice together are appropriately accounted for in our divorce settlement, I said. Which is not what your original offer did. You signed those documents. Under duress, without full disclosure of marital assets. My attorney has explained the relevant statute at some length. A silence. The practice is in my name. It has been for 30 years. It was in both our names for the first 8 years of its existence, which I can document in considerable detail as it turns out. I paused. Do you remember writing to the Hospital Privileges Committee in 1991? Calling me your business partner? You used exactly that phrase. The silence that followed was longer and had a different quality to it. Whatever you think you've found. I've found the Articles of Incorporation from March of 1986, Vincent, with both our names on them. I've also found 8 years of documentation supporting co-ownership. You used to tease me about keeping everything. My voice stayed even. I was proud of that. Turns out that was a reasonable habit. I heard him exhale. Elsa, be practical. You're 66 years old. Fighting this through the courts could take years. Do you really want to spend? My attorney believes the timeline will be considerably shorter than that, I said. He's very motivated. You'll be hearing from him. I hung up. The forensic accountant's report arrived 6 weeks later. Vance called me to his office, and when I sat down across from his desk, he slid a thick bound document toward me without saying anything. He let me read the summary page. $341,000 diverted from practice accounts over 2 years. Restaurant charges, hotel rooms, a weekend in Charleston, a long weekend in Asheville, a 10-day trip to Paris in October that Vincent had told me was a surgical conference in Cincinnati. The Paris trip landed on me like a physical weight. I had packed his carry-on for that trip. I had driven him to the airport. The practice itself, which Vincent had declared at $1.4 million, was valued by the forensic accountant at between $3.7 and $4.2 million. He had lied about nearly everything, and he had done it carefully, and he had done it for years. That night, my daughter came over to my sister's house. We sat on the back porch in the October cold, and I told her what we'd found. She went quiet in the way she does when she's holding back something large. "Mom," she said finally, "I remember being 8 years old and going to the office with you on Saturday mornings when you had billing to catch up on. I'd sit in the break room and eat crackers and do my homework. I remember you teaching the front desk girl how to process Medicare claims. I remember Dad coming in around noon sometimes and saying the whole place would fall apart without you." She looked at me. "He said that. He used to say that all the time." "He did," I said. "How does a person just decide that's not true anymore?" I didn't have a clean answer. What I believed, sitting there in the cold, was that some people revise their own history to match what they need. Vincent needed to believe he had built the practice alone, that the success was his and the credit was his. And so over time, without perhaps even noticing he was doing it, that became the story he told. And when the money was at stake and the lawyers were involved, it became the story he told under oath. The problem was that I still had the original articles of incorporation in a cardboard box. 3 weeks before the trial, Vincent came to my sister's house. She called upstairs and I came down to find him on the porch, hands in the pockets of his winter coat, looking like a man who had not been sleeping well. He had a new offer, $450,000, the house, health insurance for 2 years. I said no. Something went cold in his expression then. The negotiating version of him fell away and what was underneath was harder. "You know how these proceedings go," he said. "Everything becomes part of the record. Every argument we ever had, every difficult year, every private thing." "I have nothing to hide," I said. "Do you?" He looked at me for a moment. Then he said, in a voice deliberately designed to do damage, "You were an office manager, Elsa. An exceptionally organized one, I'll grant you that. You filed papers and handled billing and kept the lights on. Any competent administrator could have done what you did. Don't let a lawyer convince you to rewrite history so you can play the victim." I looked at him. This man I had loved for 41 years, who had once written in a letter to a hospital committee that I was his business partner, who had stood next to me in front of that glass door in March of 1986, holding keys and grinning. I looked at him and I felt something that surprised me. Nothing. Not anger, not grief. Just a cool, clear recognition that I was looking at a stranger wearing a familiar face. "Go home, Vincent," I said. I closed the door. I called Vance that same evening. "Whatever it takes," I told him. "All the way." "Good," he said, and I could hear the satisfaction in it. That's exactly what I needed to hear. The trial lasted 4 days. The former office manager, a woman who had worked at the practice for 18 years and driven herself to the courthouse at age 72 to be there, testified that I had run the administrative operation almost entirely on my own for the first decade. She looked at Vincent when she said it. He studied the table in front of him. 2 physicians who had done rotations at the practice in the late 80s both testified to being introduced to me as Dr. Hargrove's business partner, his co-founder, the person who kept the office running. One of them said, simply, everyone who worked there knew. She was the one who made it function as a business. The forensic accountant walked through $341,000 in diversions, line by line, hotel receipts on practice credit cards, airline tickets billed to the business account, a bracelet from a jewelry store charged on a Tuesday afternoon when Vincent had told me he was in surgery. When Vance cross-examined Vincent, he did it quietly. "You testified that your wife's role at the practice was administrative and did not constitute ownership," Vance said. "I'm showing you Plaintiff's Exhibit 4. This is a letter you wrote to St. Catherine's Hospital Credentialing Committee in November of 1991. Can you read the highlighted section?" Vincent's hands on the railing were surgeon's hands, trained not to move. They didn't. It says, "Administrative inquiries should be directed to my wife and co-owner, Elsa, who oversees the operational management of our joint practice." "Your co-owner," Vance said. "Your own word. Not your employee. Not your office manager. Your co-owner." He let that settle. "Is that your signature at the bottom of the document?" "Yes, but context." "And the SBA loan application from 1989. Are both your names listed as joint applicants and co-owners?" "That was." "Yes or no?" A pause. "Yes." "And the original articles of incorporation from March 1986, which were not disclosed in your initial financial filings, list your wife as equal co-founder and partner in Lexington Family Orthopedic Associates." "We restructured the practice in 1994 for legitimate tax purposes. By filing paperwork to remove your wife's name from the ownership structure, without explaining to her what she was signing. Is that a fair summary of what occurred?" Miss Caldwell objected. The judge sustained it, but she was looking at Vincent with an expression that made Miss Caldwell's objection feels beside the point. The ruling came 8 days later. I sat beside Vance with my hands quiet in my lap and listened to the judge read her findings. She found that the evidence overwhelmingly established my co-founder status and equal partnership for the practice's critical first 8 years. She found that those years, the years of building the client base, establishing hospital affiliations, developing the billing systems, recruiting staff, were inseparable from the practice's current value and could not be erased by a 1994 restructuring I had not fully understood when I signed it. She found that Vincent had committed fraud by failing to disclose the original articles of incorporation and by misrepresenting my legal status in his financial filings. She found that $341,000 in diverted funds constituted waste of marital assets and would factor into the division. "Mrs. Hargrove," she said, looking at me directly for the first time, "your documentation and record-keeping over 4 decades were decisive in this proceeding. The evidence you preserved would not have existed otherwise." I pressed my lips together and nodded once. She awarded me 64% of total marital assets, my share of the practice at the forensic valuation, the house, the diverted funds added back in, and full attorney's fees. $2,800,000. Vincent sat very still at his table. My daughter, in the row behind me, reached forward and put her hand on my shoulder. I did not look at Vincent. I had looked at him enough. 6 weeks later, the other physicians in the practice offered to buy out my interest for $1.9 million cash, wanting to force Vincent out before the IRS investigation progressed further. I told Vance to accept. By December, I had moved into a house I chose entirely for myself for the first time in my adult life. A yellow craftsman bungalow 2 miles from the university, with a wide front porch and a garden that needed work and a kitchen window that caught the afternoon light exactly right. My son assembled the bookshelf. My daughter helped hang pictures. They both kept finding reasons to check on me, the way adult children do when they're worried about you, but don't want to say so directly. I told them both, I'm fine, I'm genuinely fine. What I'd heard through the children was that Vincent was living in a downtown apartment, that the IRS audit had uncovered additional discrepancies, that Darcy had ended things sometime in the fall. My son had learned she'd moved on to someone whose bank accounts were not currently the subject of federal scrutiny. that Vincent was working reduced hours at a hospital group across town, at a salary that was a fraction of what the practice had paid him. I'd expected to feel something when I heard all that. Satisfaction, or sadness, or something I could name. Instead, sitting on my porch on a January morning with coffee and the sound of the neighborhood waking up, I felt the same thing I'd been feeling since I moved in. Quiet, the deep, full kind. I volunteer 2 mornings a week now at a women's resource center that runs a legal aid clinic. Most of the women I sit with are younger than me, and most of them arrive frightened. The particular fear of someone whose ground has just shifted and who doesn't yet know what's solid. I don't give legal advice. I'm not qualified for that. I just sit with them. I make them coffee. I tell them what I know. I tell them, keep everything, every document, every letter, every bank statement, every piece of paper that passes through your hands. File it, label it, put it in a box, in a closet if you have to. You may never need it. But if you do, it will be worth more than you can imagine. I tell them, the work you do is real, whether or not your name appears anywhere official. The years are real. Don't let anyone convince you otherwise. And sometimes, if it feels right, I tell them about the night I sat at my sister's kitchen table at 2 in the morning and opened a cardboard box I'd been meaning to sort through for years. I tell them about the articles of incorporation with my name on them, faded typescript on 39-year-old paper, and how my hands stopped shaking the moment I read them. I was 66 when my life came apart. I'm 67 now, and I keep every piece of paper I've ever been handed, and I have never in my life been more certain of who I am.